Tonight, let me take your hand in silence and lead you away from the ordinary streets of history. We are not stepping into a grand palace or a battlefield tonight. No, our path drifts into a quieter place, one the official maps barely acknowledge. It is a place that exists in shadows, half denied and half protected, whispered about but rarely described aloud. Imagine walking with me through the stillness of a medieval town after dark. The bells of evening have already faded, and most households have shuttered their doors. Yet somewhere beyond the respectable squares, there is a quarter that still stirs. A district where lanterns burn later than they should, where laughter and footsteps echo in defiance of the curfew. Lean closer as I speak, for this journey is not for the casual ear. We are about to slip into the realm that city fathers condemned from the pulpit, while at the same time quietly counted its coins in their ledgers. What lies ahead is not a tale of simple indulgence or fleeting desire. It is the story of an entire system built around the tension between temptation and regulation, between the sermons of morality and the calculations of commerce. To step through its doors is to uncover how survival, profit, and hypocrisy intertwined in the fabric of daily life. Do not imagine that what we are about to encounter is only about intimacy in the night. No, it is also about politics written in bylaws, about taxes disguised as penance, about communities forced to live on the edge of respectability while serving as the city's unspoken engine. Behind the curtain of secrecy stand questions of power: who controls, who profits, and who pays the price. Each whispered transaction, each guarded secret leaves a mark on the city's conscience, whether officials admit it or not. The tone of our walk is hushed, conspiratorial, as though we are trespassers in history itself. Yet it is also daring, because to truly understand the medieval city, we cannot avert our gaze from the very places it tried hardest to hide. These streets, painted in scandal and hypocrisy, reveal more about human survival and the nature of authority than any sermon could hope to teach. So let us not linger in hesitation. The night air is heavy, and the cobblestones are guiding our steps forward. Ahead lies a narrow lane, winding like a secret whispered through the dark. At the end of it stands a doorway painted in a color no passerby could mistake, an entrance that beckons us into another world. Come closer. It is time to push beyond the surface of the city and cross into the stories that wait behind that painted door. You move slowly now, your steps pressing against the uneven cobblestones. The stones are cool beneath your soles, and the faint glow of lantern light wavers along the walls, throwing crooked shadows that seem to breathe with the night. The respectable part of the city has already gone to sleep. Shutters are drawn tight, doors bolted, silence clinging like a heavy cloak. But as you drift further away from the quiet squares, the air begins to change. At first, the sounds are only hints. A burst of muffled laughter slips out from behind a shutter. Somewhere close, the sharp clink of a cup against a table echoes down the stone corridor. And then, as you press on, a whisper of music, faint and hesitant, finds its way to your ear. It is a melody too soft to be a festival, too secret to be sung for the town at large. These sounds travel cautiously, like secrets searching for a safe listener. The lane you follow narrows, bending into a path that looks half forgotten by daylight. Weeds creep between the stones, plaster crumbles from the walls, and yet the place does not feel abandoned. Quite the opposite. It feels watched, as if unseen eyes have already marked your arrival. Here, trade is not displayed in open stalls or market squares. Here, commerce is wrapped in whispers, exchanged behind guarded doors, hidden, but alive. Think back to the other streets you have just left behind. The proud guild halls with their carved emblems, the bakeries where ovens glowed with bread for the morning meal. Those places wore their trade openly, as badges of civic pride. But here, signs are painted in quiet symbols, colors that speak to those who know how to read them. Instead of welcoming thresholds, there are guarded doorways where shadows linger. Instead of open stalls, there are curtains, shutters, and watchful figures who lean in alleys, scanning faces with practiced caution. Your curiosity sharpens into unease. This street feels different, forbidden, set apart not by distance, but by intention. And yet, the anticipation builds, pulling you forward step by step. Every flicker of lamplight, every muted sound behind a shutter, every trace of hidden life promises that something just ahead waits to reveal itself. The lane curves once more, bending into darkness. Then, as if conjured by your own restless curiosity, it appears before you. A single doorway, painted in a bold color no passerby could mistake. The doorway stands before you, its color deep and striking even in the wavering lantern glow. It is not carved with fine artistry or decorated with noble crests. There is no marble frame or gilded edge. Instead, it is plain wood, worn smooth by countless hands, yet the paint upon it gives it power. The red is not about beauty, but about recognition. It is a signal, a mark, a quiet proclamation of what lies within. To see this door is to know what kind of threshold it guards. And yet, here is the paradox. This doorway is both forbidden and permitted. The city that builds its churches and guild halls also allows this red-painted entrance to stand openly. It is tolerated, even regulated, not because virtue has softened, but because coin flows steadily through it. Sin may be preached against from pulpits, but its weight is measured in taxes, fines, and revenues that help pave streets and repair walls. The authorities condemn the act, yet they keep a careful count of the earnings it brings. Your hand reaches for the latch, and with a push, the air changes. The cold night falls away behind you, and sudden warmth presses against your skin. The air inside is thick, heavy with the mingled smells of smoke, spilled ale, sweat, and a sweetness meant to disguise it all. The shift is overwhelming, every sense stirred at once. Where outside the streets held their cautious quiet, here the noise strikes immediately. Voices overlapping, bursts of laughter, a cough, a shout, the scrape of a chair across stone. The room is not one of elegance. The benches are rough, the candles burn low and uneven, and the walls are stained with years of use. Yet it is crowded, alive, and strangely magnetic. The people here fill the space with restless energy. Workers moving quickly from table to table, customers leaning too close, shadows gathering in corners where private words are exchanged. It is at once shabby and vibrant, condemned in sermons yet impossible to empty. You stand at the threshold, absorbing the contradiction. This place is despised and desired, hidden and obvious, condemned yet counted upon. To cross this door is to step into a theater of survival, a stage where every gesture, every glance, and every whispered bargain keeps the machinery turning. Now that we've stepped inside, the performance of vice and survival begins. The sound strikes first, a wall of noise that presses against your ears the moment you cross the threshold. Voices rise and clash in uneven harmony. Men arguing over dice, a woman laughing too loudly, a sharp shout followed by muffled curses. Somewhere behind it all, a small stringed instrument struggles to be heard, its tune tangled with coughs and the scrape of mugs across wooden tables. The air vibrates with overlapping rhythms, chaotic yet strangely cohesive, like a chorus no one planned but everyone contributes to. Then the smells arrive, carried thick on the warmth of the room. Smoke hangs heavy in the rafters, curling from candles and small braziers, sinking down to mingle with the reek of cheap ale spilled on the floor. The sour tang of unwashed bodies clings to every corner, but someone has attempted to fight it. Sharp perfumes drift through the air, sweet at first, but cloying when mixed with the rest. The effect is dizzying, an olfactory storm that overwhelms even as it draws you further inside. Your eyes adjust to the dim light, and the layout begins to take shape. Rough benches crowd the center of the room, their surfaces scarred by knives and stained by drink. Makeshift partitions stand here and there, flimsy walls meant to create privacy, but offering little more than a shadowed illusion. Candle stubs flicker in their holders, throwing uneven light that deepens the shadows at the edges. In those darker corners, figures lean close together, their faces half hidden, their conversations meant for no outsider's ear. The room is a patchwork of openness and concealment, every space shaped by necessity, rather than design. As you take in the scene, patterns of power emerge almost immediately. Some figures move with ease, their gestures broad and assured, their laughter carrying above the din. They claim the center of the room without effort, as though the space bends to them. Others remain at the edges, shoulders drawn in, glances darting, careful not to take up more space than allowed. Confidence and anxiety live side by side here, visible in every posture and every stolen glance. It is a hierarchy without uniforms, marked only by how one holds their body and how others respond. The noise, the smell, the dim light, the uneven balance of confidence and fear, it all threatens to sweep you away. But before we get lost in the noise, we should ask, how did such places exist at all? Step back with me now, away from the candle smoke and the crowded benches, to see the wider picture. These houses did not appear by chance, springing up like weeds in the cracks of medieval life. They were not simply tolerated as a necessary evil that slipped through the gaps of morality. No, many of them were municipal projects, sanctioned and planned by the very officials who swore they were guardians of virtue. Their existence was carefully woven into the city's structure, plotted on maps, monitored by clerks, and tallied in the books where every coin was meant to be accounted for. The justification came in a familiar phrase: to contain sin. City councils and magistrates insisted that by limiting vice to specific districts, they could keep the rest of the town clean. Better to gather the trouble in one place, they argued, than to allow it to spread unseen through every street and household. Yet beneath that thin veil of civic concern lay another truth, one that sparkled in the treasuries. Containment was never only about morality, it was about profit. Fines were levied, entry fees collected, rents extracted, and all of it lined the coffers of the same government that warned citizens to stay away. The hypocrisy could not have been sharper. In the morning, the bells rang, and sermons thundered from pulpits about temptation, sin, and eternal damnation. Preachers pointed fingers at the very doors painted in warning colors, condemning those who entered as corrupt. But by nightfall, the same city counted the revenue, balancing accounts with satisfaction, as if souls and sins were merely items on a ledger. What was condemned in spirit was embraced in coin, and no one in power could quite ignore how useful such a system was for financing the works of the city, bridges, walls, even the churches themselves. The tone of the story twists here, no longer just explanation but irony sharpened into critique. The double standard was not hidden, it was blatant, announced in sermons and confirmed in records. Sin was a public enemy when spoken of, but a private benefactor when taxed. What the city denounced with one hand, it quietly encouraged with the other. This is the uneasy balance that defined medieval life, the stage performance of morality and the backstage reality of profit. One city in particular became famous for turning vice into policy. Let us pause in one particular place, a city that prided itself on order and precision, where nothing was left to chance, not even sin. Here, vice was not scattered loosely across the streets, but was confined to a single quarter, bounded by stone walls and guarded gates. Imagine it, a district carved out by law, as though desire itself could be contained by mortar and watchtowers. The boundaries were no accident. They were written into statutes, drawn onto maps, and physically enforced, so that everyone knew where the permitted transgressions belonged. The quarter itself carried the stamp of regulation. Narrow lanes were hemmed in by tall walls, creating a sense of separation from the rest of the city. At the entrances, gates stood not to welcome but to restrict, their purpose less about safety and more about visibility. Anyone who passed through was marked by the very act of entering, as though the stones themselves recorded the transgression. Within these boundaries, the houses operated under the eyes of clerks and constables who tallied fines, checked ledgers, and ensured the rules were followed closely enough to keep appearances intact. Those rules reached even to the bodies of the people who lived and worked there. Officials decreed what clothing could and could not be worn, garments plain and unmistakable, designed to separate workers from the honorable women of the city. Some cities required hoods of a certain color, others distinctive dresses, each regulation a mark meant to erase individuality and replace it with a brand. Curfews were enforced, forbidding movement outside the walls after certain hours, as though the body itself were property of the city, to be stored away when the clock demanded. The effect was both chilling and humiliating. To walk through the city in the mandated clothing was to carry a scarlet signal, a living reminder of one's place in the hierarchy. The walls did not just confine, they announced to the world who was inside and why. This was governance stripped of compassion, calculated as coolly as a merchant balancing a ledger. It was humiliation elevated to policy, a system that masked cruelty beneath the language of order. But regulation was never just about control, it was also about money. Step inside the city's record books for a moment, and you will see that the red-painted doors were not simply tolerated for convenience. They were a revenue stream, as regular and reliable as any toll bridge or grain market. The system was layered with fines, entry fees, and special levies designed to turn vice into steady income. A man caught breaking curfew on his way to the quarter might pay a fee at the gate. Workers inside were taxed on their earnings, with a portion going directly into the civic treasury. Even the houses themselves owed fixed rents, collected by officials who arrived with ink-stained fingers and ledgers under their arms. Every laugh, every whisper, every coin exchanged in the shadows was, in the end, tallied and taxed. These revenues did not disappear into secret pockets. They were recorded openly, accounted for in the city's annual budgets, and put toward projects that the entire population used. Stone bridges across the river were repaired with this money. Sections of the city wall, cracked from years of siege and weather, stood firm again thanks to the same coin. And most striking of all, even churches and chapels, those bastions of holiness, were funded in part by revenues taken from houses the sermons condemned. The city, in its practical wisdom, did not discriminate between the purity of one coin and the stain of another. The irony is almost too sharp to miss. A preacher could stand beneath a vaulted ceiling, his voice echoing warnings about the fires of hell, without mentioning that the beams above his head were held in place by funds drawn from sin money. The pews polished for worshippers had been restored with taxes taken from the very people he cursed in his sermon. Faith and finance shared the same foundation, though one was cloaked in incense and the other in secrecy. It was an unspoken pact. Morality was thundered from the pulpit in the morning, while in the evening, the same moralists reaped the benefits without a word. The narrator's voice in recounting this cannot help but slip into satire. Here was a society that built walls and painted doors to mark shame, but then dipped its hand into that same shame to fund its proudest achievements. Morality was preached loudly, but coins were collected quietly. The double standard was not a flaw in the system, it was the system. Condemn with one breath, count with the next. That was the true rhythm of the medieval city, a rhythm measured less in bells than in clinking coin. But taxation was only one layer. There was also a blur between brothel and bath. Step into the bathhouse, and the air changes at once. The heavy scent of smoke and ale from the brothel gives way to something wetter, thicker, almost suffocating in its own way. Steam curls from every corner, clinging to the damp stone walls, blurring the outlines of doorways and faces alike. Water splashes rhythmically as attendants carry wooden buckets from cisterns, pouring them into shallow pools that glimmer in the candlelight. The heat presses close, making your skin prickle, and each breath is a mixture of moisture, soap, and the faint trace of mildew rising from the wet floor. The echo of laughter bounces off the vaulted ceilings, mingling with the steady slap of water against stone. Officially, these places were promoted as centers of cleanliness and health. City authorities pointed to them with pride, describing how they kept the citizens washed, refreshed, and, at least in theory, guarded against disease. For a small fee, a man or woman could enjoy the luxury of heated water, a towel, perhaps even herbal infusions to soothe tired muscles. The rhetoric of hygiene became a shield, a justification for allowing such establishments to flourish. What better way to demonstrate civic concern than to keep the population clean? It was the language of good governance, practical and respectable on the surface. But everyone knew that the bathhouse served more than soap and steam. Behind the haze of vapor and the curtain of laughter, there were other transactions, Pools and private chambers became stages for encounters never written in official ordinances. Attendants offered more than towels. Conversations extended beyond the casual chatter of health. The blurred line was understood by all and denied by none, though it was rarely spoken aloud. What was sold as cleanliness often cloaked intimacy, and what began as care for the body sometimes ended in the very activities the city claimed to regulate elsewhere. This dual role made the bathhouse a point of constant contention. City leaders, seeing the revenue and the supposed benefits, were willing to tolerate the ambiguity. Their logic was pragmatic: better to watch it, tax it, and claim it served the common good than to pretend it could be stamped out. But the church saw matters differently. To the preachers, a bathhouse that doubled as a brothel was a mockery of sanctity. Water meant for purification was being sullied, they said, turned from cleansing to temptation. Sermons rained down in condemnation, demanding that the authorities shut the doors, strip away the steam, and end the pretense of hygiene masking sin. And so, the bathhouse stood as a monument to contradiction. It was both praised and cursed, tolerated and condemned, a place where soap and scandal floated side by side in the rising mist. The city saw health, the church saw corruption, and the people themselves saw opportunity. The walls were damp, the air was heavy, and every visitor knew the truth, even if no official dared to write it plainly. And within those walls, the rules were not as clear as officials pretended. On the surface, everything was neatly arranged. The statutes were copied onto parchment in fine, deliberate script, signed with seals, and stored in the city archives as if words themselves could tame desire. The rules were detailed and numerous. No solicitation on holy days, when bells rang for mass. No loud singing or laughter that might disturb the quiet streets after curfew. No theft, no brawling, no gambling within the walls of these establishments. Each article was set down with the solemnity of law, framed as a bulwark against chaos. The clerks who wrote them may have even believed they were drawing boundaries firm enough to hold. But what was written by candlelight in the town hall bore little resemblance to what unfolded in the dim chambers of the houses or the mist-filled air of the bathhouses. Every regulation had its loophole, every restriction its exception. Holy days were observed until a coin was offered, and then the rule melted away like wax near a flame. Singing might be hushed when patrols passed, only to roar back louder once the lantern light receded. Theft was condemned on parchment, but pockets were picked nightly, purses disappeared, and complaints were often ignored so long as bribes were quietly paid to the right official. The laws existed, yes, but their breaking was so common it almost seemed part of the system itself. The irony was impossible to miss. Regulations were composed in ornate Latin, a language polished and precise, but the reality they sought to restrain was messy, ungoverned, and entirely human. Picture the contrast: a clerk hunched in his chamber, quill scratching carefully as he pens. Let there be no singing after sunset, while only a few streets away, the brothel swells with drunken songs, clapping, and shouts so loud the windows rattle. The parchment remained untouched, rolled and stored, while life unraveled in noise and contradiction. The gap between law and living was wide enough to swallow the city whole. And yet, officials played their part in the charade. Patrols strode through occasionally, enforcing one or two rules when it suited them, often ignoring the rest. Fines were collected selectively, punishments handed out not to maintain order, but to maintain appearances. If the bishop asked, the city could show its statutes with pride. Look, rules exist, morality is safeguarded. But beneath that thin facade, everyone knew the truth. Law was for display, reality for survival. The narrator's tone here turns sardonic, because there is no other way to describe such hollow regulation. Law on parchment, life in shadows. The rules were never meant to be iron chains. They were silk curtains, drawn to give the illusion of control, while everyone involved walked freely through the folds. It was a play, staged for the benefit of morality, performed nightly in the alleys and courtyards, where actors and audience both understood the script was make-believe. And sometimes, the tension boiled over into the streets. The street that only yesterday rang with drunken songs and hushed bargains now thunders with a different kind of noise. The crowd gathers quickly, spilling from the market into narrow lanes, voices rising until they merge into a single roar. Torches flare against the night sky, their flames casting wild shadows across stone walls. Men and women alike shout their fury, their words drowned in the sheer volume of the mob. The air is sharp with smoke and sweat, and each heartbeat feels matched to the pounding of countless feet on the cobblestones. The spark that set it ablaze is not hard to name. Some whisper it began with anger over curfews. Why should respectable townsfolk be punished with restrictions, while the painted doors stayed open for those who could afford them? Others claim the fury came from taxes, levies laid upon ordinary households, while the city lined its purse with revenues from the very vices it condemned. Still others murmur of corruption, rumors that officials pocketed coin, that guards turned blind eyes in exchange for favors. Whatever the truth, resentment festers until it breaks loose, and tonight it has broken wide. The mob surges toward the quarter, and the first stones fly. Windows shatter under the assault, splinters of glass falling like cruel stars onto the pavement. Doors are battered by fists and boots, hinges groaning before splintering open. Someone tips a torch against a shutter, and the wood crackles as flames catch, smoke billowing upward into the night. Screams mix with laughter, curses with cries for mercy, as the line between vengeance and chaos dissolves. In that moment, the buildings themselves seem to groan beneath the weight of the fury unleashed against them. Yet for all the violence, the deeper story is not one of endings, but of repetition. These riots burn fiercely, but they do not erase what they target. Brothels are smashed, walls blackened, doors broken down. But as soon as the anger ebbs and the smoke clears, the city coffers quietly demand their return. Too much money lies within those walls for them to remain in ruins for long. The same officials who shake their heads in public at the damage are the ones who order the rebuilding, ensuring the system will stand again. The pattern becomes almost predictable. Resentment rises, crowds rebel, buildings burn, and then the cycle resets. Outrage smolders into embers, but commerce rekindles the flame of survival, and soon enough, laughter, bargaining, and music return to the very same streets where torches had raged. The crowd may believe it has silenced the quarter, but history shows otherwise. Destruction is temporary, demand is eternal. And yet, despite violence, these places kept returning, because the demand never vanished. Step back inside, away from the roaring crowd and the smoke of riots, into the smaller, quieter machinery that kept one house running. Behind the laughter, the singing, and the hum of constant activity, there was another rhythm, the scrape of a quill across parchment. In a back room at a rough wooden table, the ledger sat open. Numbers lined its pages, neat columns of figures recording every coin that came in and every coin that went out. For all the chaos outside, here everything was reduced to marks of ink, each stroke binding workers and patrons alike into the silent grip of arithmetic. At first glance, it might seem the workers inside this house were earning steady coin. A customer paid for an hour, for company, for drink, and the fee was counted immediately. But the ledger showed how swiftly those earnings dissolved. From every sum, the first cut went to rent. The house itself demanded payment for the roof under which the work was done. Then came the cost of food, for no one was permitted to eat without paying for bread, broth, or ale supplied by the establishment. Even the candles that burned in the chambers were charged, their stubs counted against the workers' portion. Each necessity was another deduction, another bite out of already meager pay. The list of expenses seemed endless. If a garment tore, the repair was charged. If illness struck, medicine was sold at inflated prices, added neatly to the account. Even fines for small infractions, a missed curfew, an argument overheard by the wrong ears, were entered with the same cold precision. What began as a night's wage often dwindled to nothing by the time the ledger was balanced. In some cases, workers found themselves owing the house more than they had earned, their labor pulling them deeper into a cycle of debt rather than freeing them from it. The exploitation was not hidden. It was systematic, calculated, and carefully justified. Every deduction came with a reason, A bed had to be maintained, food had to be purchased, candles had to be replaced. On parchment, it looked orderly, even fair. But the reality beneath the numbers was one of entrapment. The house profited at every turn, ensuring that the workers' dependence never weakened, that the cycle of obligation spun endlessly, no matter how many nights were endured or how many coins exchanged. And yet, the tone here must remain unsentimental. It is easy to imagine these lives only through the lens of suffering, but the truth was more complicated. There was resilience in their survival, a determination to carve out some form of agency within a system designed to strip it away. Sympathy is owed, yes, but what stands out most is the clarity of exploitation, the cold arithmetic that reduced human experience to figures on a page. The ledger was more than a book of accounts. It was a mirror of power itself, showing in ink the imbalance between those who labored and those who collected. And at the center of it all stood the woman who managed the house. At the head of the house stood its overseer, the figure everyone knew and few dared to cross, the madam. She was not draped in finery like the wealthy patrons who passed through her doors, but in garments that spoke of practicality and command. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, always scanning the room as though every candle, every loaf of bread, every whispered bargain belonged to her alone. Workers feared her presence, for her word could mean a night's rest withheld, a debt doubled, or a punishment quietly recorded in the ledger. Yet beneath that fear simmered resentment, for all knew she profited most while they carried the weight of the labor. Her authority rested not only in her presence, but in the small rituals of control she performed daily. She collected payments with a practiced hand, counting coins with the precision of a clerk. No transaction escaped her notice. Even the smallest exchange was observed, noted, and deducted. Rules were enforced with an almost mechanical efficiency. Curfews imposed, arguments silenced, appearances maintained. A late return, a complaint from a customer, even a careless laugh at the wrong moment could bring reprimand. Order, as she defined it, was the lifeblood of the house, and she ensured that lifeblood never faltered. And yet, her position was never as secure as it seemed. For all her power, she too was bound to the system, a manager caught within the very machinery she controlled. The city demanded its share from her, just as she demanded from the workers. Fines and rents climbed upon her shoulders as well, and though she sat above others in the hierarchy, the balance of her life was no less precarious. Authority was hers to wield, but it was borrowed authority, granted only so long as she kept the profits flowing. She was both ruler and captive, feared and pitied, her strength shaped by necessity more than choice. The narrator's voice here turns measured, refusing to paint her as a simple villain. She was ruthless, yes, and often cruel in her enforcement, but she was also a survivor in a world that allowed few safe paths. Her role was carved by circumstance, her choices narrowed by structures larger than herself. To the workers beneath her, she might appear as the face of oppression, yet to those above her, she was only another cog in the machine. Villain and victim, profiteer and prisoner. She lived at the intersection of both, her power undeniable, but never absolute. And she did not work alone. Shadows moved for her. Lurking at the edges of the room, half hidden in the dim candlelight, stood the figures who rarely spoke yet never needed to. These were the enforcers, the hired muscle of the house, broad-shouldered men with heavy hands, eyes that scanned the crowd with suspicion, and faces set like stone. They were not there for charm or conversation. Their role was simpler, darker, and always understood. Where the madam's authority was written in ledgers, theirs was carried in fists and in the silent promise of violence. Their methods were effective precisely because they relied on intimidation as much as action. A slow step forward, the narrowing of eyes, a hand placed too casually on the hilt of a dagger. These gestures often spoke louder than words. If a customer hesitated to pay, the enforcers were there to collect, ensuring the debt was settled before anyone left the room. If a worker muttered too loudly about unfair deductions or cruelty, the shadows shifted closer until the protest fell quiet. Complaints disappeared not because they were resolved, but because they were smothered. The presence of these men kept everyone uneasy, caught in a web of silent threat. Patrons, though wealthy or bold when they entered, lowered their voices once they felt those eyes upon them. Laughter dulled, boasts softened, for all knew the house tolerated no defiance. Workers too walked carefully, their steps measured, their words guarded, never sure when a careless remark might draw unwanted attention. The enforcers blurred the line between order and menace, their very existence a reminder that survival inside these walls was not secured by fairness, but by fear. The narrator's tone here grows darker, not sensational but factual, as though describing a grim architecture of control. The enforcers were not nameless shadows. They were the machinery that kept the system intact, ensuring profits flowed and rules were obeyed. They were not above violence, nor below humiliation, and their silence was as heavy as their fists. Everyone inside, the workers, the customers, even the madam herself, moved with an awareness of their gaze. Yet even these walls could not keep out the most dangerous threat: secrets. Not every man who slipped through the painted doorway came with his face uncovered. Many cloaked themselves in anonymity, pulling hoods low or wrapping scarves high, hoping the dim candlelight would hide what their wealth and stature could not. These were merchants, officials, even men tied to the very institutions that thundered against sin from the pulpit or the council chamber. Their presence was both an open secret and a dangerous one, for it placed power and vulnerability side by side in the same narrow room. The workers, more than anyone, understood the weight of this secret knowledge. Every whispered conversation, every exchanged glance, every night's transaction carried with it the potential to unravel a reputation built carefully in daylight. A name overheard, a distinctive ring or cloak recognized, a careless word muttered after too much drink. All could become a weapon sharper than any blade. In their silence lay protection, but in their voices lay power. Few dared to wield it openly, but all knew the potential was there. There were stories, always murmured in half tones, of what happened when secrets threatened to surface. Sometimes a worker would hint at what she had seen, and suddenly her debts would vanish, her rent mysteriously eased. At other times, hush money was slipped across the table in heavy purses, coins paid not for service but for silence. And in darker tales, arrests came suddenly, cloaked in the language of morality, when someone knew too much or dared to speak what should never leave the house's walls. The line between protection and punishment was thin, and it was the powerful who decided how it was drawn. The narrator's tone here sharpens, suspenseful, almost like a spy recounting coded exchanges. The brothel was more than a place of pleasure. It was a vault of secrets, and like any vault, it could be broken open for profit or revenge. In this sense, every worker carried invisible weapons: memory, recognition, the fragile knowledge of who came and why. To hold such secrets was dangerous. To speak them aloud was often fatal, and the law, predictably, was written to protect the powerful. When one turns to the parchments of the city council, the words appear lofty, draped in the language of virtue. Ordinances were written as though they were sermons, speaking of the need to guard morality, to shield citizens from temptation, to uphold the honor of the city's name. Yet beneath the solemn phrasing lay something far more practical: contracts of economy dressed in the robes of piety. Every rule that claimed to protect souls also ensured the treasury remained full. To read these statutes closely is to see that law and commerce were not strangers, but uneasy partners bound together on the same page. Among the most common phrases in these ordinances was disorderly conduct. It was a charge so vague, so pliable, that it could be stretched to fit nearly any situation. A worker who returned late to her assigned room might be guilty of disorderly conduct. A laugh that carried too loudly into the street could be labeled the same. A patron who refused to pay was rarely held accountable, but a worker who complained about it risked being fined for creating disturbance. The charge was less a tool of justice than a lever of control, bent always to push down those who had the least power to resist. The punishments, though varied, shared one intent: humiliation. Some were marched through the streets in thin clothing, jeered at by crowds who themselves might have passed through the painted door the night before. Others were forced to pay fines so heavy they erased weeks of earnings, binding them tighter to the debt that already held them captive. Still others were locked in stocks, their bodies displayed in the marketplace, left to endure the spit and insults of passers-by. Public shame was not an accident of the law. It was the law, designed as both spectacle and warning. The tone, when describing these measures, cannot remain neutral for long. At first, the words of the statutes read formal, orderly, almost detached. But when placed against the lived reality, the irony cuts deep. The city claimed it punished sin to preserve moral order, yet in truth it profited doubly, once by taxing the act, and again by fining those caught breaking the very rules built to trap them. Law was less an instrument of justice than a performance, an elaborate stage where the roles of villain and victim were already assigned and the conclusion foregone. And still, the cycle spun. Shame, profit, repetition. Step into the marketplace on the morning after an arrest, and you will see how easily punishment turned into performance. A woman marched through the streets with her hair cut short, her clothes deliberately torn, became not simply a criminal, but an actor thrust into a role written by the city itself. The guards walked her forward, but it was the eyes of the crowd that gave the moment its power. The street was no longer just a place of commerce or passage. It had become a theater, and the punishment was its play. The audience needed little prompting. Neighbors leaned out of windows to shout insults. Vendors paused their trade to laugh. Children followed at a distance, throwing pebbles or jeering with words they scarcely understood. What the law defined as correction, the people treated as entertainment. A body in the stocks, hands pinned, face exposed, became an open invitation for mockery. The louder the laughter, the more effective the warning, or so the authorities claimed. In reality, it was cruelty repackaged as civic duty. The emotional weight of the scene rests on the one forced into this role. Stripped of dignity, reduced to a symbol of transgression, the punished person ceased to be an individual. Their story, their reasons, their humanity were erased in favor of the spectacle. To the crowd, they were no longer a worker with debts, a mother with children, or a daughter caught in poverty. They were simply an object lesson, a living signboard declaring, "This is what happens when you step outside the line." The narrator's voice begins in sardonic observation, noting how easily moral outrage turned into carnival laughter, but then slows into something heavier. For behind the noise, the truth is clear. Humiliation did not cleanse sin, nor did it prevent it. It only stripped away the humanity of those who were already most vulnerable, turning suffering into amusement for those safely outside the walls. What passed as justice was little more than cruelty staged for a willing audience. But humiliation was only one side. Instruction manuals offered their own strange guidance. Among the more curious artifacts left behind by the Middle Ages are the so-called manuals of intimacy, written as though they were scholarly works, yet filled with advice that today borders on the absurd. These were not secret scrolls hidden away in libraries, but texts copied and circulated, half medicine, half folklore, meant to guide people in matters that polite society pretended not to discuss. Bound in rough parchment, they carried the weight of learning, but were infused with superstition, charm, and more than a little imagination. Within their pages, the advice veered from the practical to the fantastical. One might find a recipe for a potion promising to cure desire thought excessive, brewed from herbs steeped in wine and mixed with the ashes of a burned feather. Another offered charms to ensure fidelity. Wear a carved stone beneath your clothes, or slip a knot of hair beneath the pillow. Remedies abounded for ailments of love. Strange ointments rubbed onto the skin, powders scattered in drink, even whispered incantations said to restore passion or banish it altogether. The line between medicine and magic was faint and often crossed without hesitation. Some of these instructions provoke laughter now. One text advised that eating certain fish would guarantee male vigor, while another swore that carrying a dried frog's leg would prevent unfaithfulness. Such claims seem almost theatrical in their absurdity, a reminder of how limited knowledge left space for invention. Yet behind the comedy of their prescriptions lies a real window into medieval thought. the blending of body and spirit, of health and morality, of science and superstition. People longed for control in a world that seemed unpredictable, and these manuals promised it, however fanciful the methods. The narrator's tone here tilts into playfulness, even mockery, for it is difficult not to smile at the thought of solemn clerks copying recipes for love potions alongside passages of Holy Scripture. But the laughter softens when we remember the seriousness with which these words were once taken. Superstition was not harmless entertainment. It shaped lives, choices, and even judgments. Belief in charms and magic might dictate who was trusted, who was shunned, and in darker moments, who was accused of corruption or witchcraft. For where superstition spread, persecution often followed. It did not take much for superstition to turn from curiosity into condemnation. The same charms and potions that once seemed harmless enough to be scribbled in manuals could, in the wrong climate, become damning evidence. Women who worked within brothels often stood at the center of these storms, for they were already branded as outsiders, tolerated for their labor, yet mistrusted for their existence. In a society that needed scapegoats, they became easy targets. Fears of illness, failed crops, or misfortune at sea were rarely blamed on chance. Instead, the anxious imagination of the community sought a face, a culprit, and those already living at the margins carried the burden. A whispered rumor that a woman had brewed herbs for a client could be twisted into proof of witchcraft. A customer's sudden illness might be traced back, not to poor ale or disease, but to some imagined curse cast in a hidden chamber. Fear projected itself onto those least able to defend themselves. Accusations came swiftly, and evidence was rarely more than suspicion. Interrogations were harsh, designed not to discover truth, but to confirm what was already assumed. A woman questioned might be pressed again and again about charms, about potions, about secret rites never practiced but easily invented by her accuser. Neighbors testified to odd behavior, to strange looks, to imagined rituals glimpsed in the shadows. The line between gossip and testimony disappeared, and with it, the chance for justice. The narrator's tone turns grave here, for these accusations were not just words. They carried the threat of punishment, of isolation, of violence. To be accused of witchcraft was to stand at the edge of a cliff, the ground already crumbling beneath your feet. Sympathy rises naturally for those caught in this net. Women who may have brewed no more than an herbal tea, yet found themselves branded as dangerous, unholy, corrupt. Their lives became cautionary tales twisted by fear, their voices silenced under the weight of suspicion. And once witch hunts began, escape was nearly impossible. Across Europe, there were seasons when fear itself seemed to take root in the soil, spreading like wildfire from one town to the next. Whispers of witchcraft grew into shouts, and accusations leapt from neighbor to neighbor, sparing no village, no parish, no family untouched. Entire regions lived under a cloud of suspicion, where misfortune of any kind, failed harvests, sudden storms, illness without cure, was quickly given a human face. To the fearful, it was easier to imagine malice at work than to accept the cruelty of chance. The hysteria gathered momentum, feeding on itself, until reason was drowned out by panic. Within this climate, brothel workers became especially vulnerable. They were already marked by society as transgressors, their painted doors and restricted quarters serving as visible reminders of their exclusion. To accuse such women of witchcraft required no leap of imagination for their neighbors. It was an accusation that seemed to flow naturally from their status. They were poor, dependent, and mistrusted. They carried reputations that could not defend them, and lives that could not be easily hidden. A whispered charge against them did not need proof. Their very existence, already branded as shameful, became evidence enough. The narrator's voice turns heavy here, because the cruelty was both deliberate and convenient. Fear always demands victims, and society chooses those who can be sacrificed with the least resistance. To accuse the wealthy, the powerful, the respected, would be unthinkable. But to accuse a woman who lived in the margins of a walled quarter, who carried debts in a ledger she could never pay, who was already dismissed in sermons as unworthy. That was simple. Fear pointed its finger, and authority nodded along. The outrage rises naturally from this truth. These women were not accused for what they had done, but for what they represented, the city's unease with its own contradictions, its reliance on vice paired with its desire to condemn it. They became vessels into which society poured its guilt, its dread, its helplessness. Once marked, they had no escape, for the machinery of witch hunting offered no space for defense. Accusation was itself conviction, and the punishments were merciless. And yet, after the anger subsides, the narrator's tone sinks into resignation. History shows that in times of fear, reason falters, and the same cycle repeats. Convenient victims chosen, their lives destroyed, their memory distorted into cautionary tales. The climate of witch hunts was less about finding evil than about managing fear, and those who were already vulnerable carried the heaviest cost. And yet, even in the darkest times, bonds of survival formed. Not every story within these walls was one of humiliation or fear. If we pause, quiet our steps, and listen more carefully, another layer of life begins to reveal itself. The narrator's voice softens here, shifting from the sharpness of law and accusation to something more reflective, almost tender. For in the dim light of shared rooms, among the clatter of cups and the hum of music, bonds were formed, fragile, unrecorded, but deeply human. These bonds were not written into ledgers or recorded in statutes. They grew in whispers exchanged late at night, in moments of comfort shared between those who understood each other's burdens. Friendships formed in the shadows, alliances that helped one another survive the relentless demands of the house. A crust of bread quietly given, a shift covered to ease exhaustion, a word of warning passed along when the madam's temper flared. These were acts of loyalty that defied the machinery of exploitation. They were small, but they mattered, and sometimes friendship reached further, into spaces that society could not acknowledge. Glimpses of quiet love flickered here, often between women who found in one another a gentleness the world outside refused them. These connections were not public, not loud. They were private sanctuaries, built from trust and carried with dignity. The narrator does not treat them as spectacle, for they were never meant to be displayed. Instead, they are honored as part of the complexity of life in these quarters, proof that even in hardship, people searched for and found intimacy that went beyond transaction. The emotional resonance of this moment lies in its defiance. These houses were designed to exploit, to strip away agency, and reduce human beings to coin and contract. Yet within their confines, humanity still carved out spaces of its own. A hand held in the dark, laughter shared after a long night, a promise of protection whispered in secret. These became sanctuaries, fragile but real. In a world that sought to reduce them to shadows, they created light for one another. Even in places designed to exploit, humanity carved small sanctuaries. And it is here, in these bonds of survival and love, that the story deepens, preparing us to explore the hidden networks that stretched far beyond these walls. There was another figure who began to appear in these districts, a figure who did not belong solely to the brothel or the bathhouse, but who carried with them the shimmer of the theater, the stage performer. These individuals blurred the line between entertainment and intimacy, stepping onto makeshift platforms or into candlelit corners where performance and desire folded into one another. They were dancers, singers, storytellers, sometimes actors in bawdy plays, each gesture exaggerated, each costume chosen to spark both laughter and longing. In their presence, the brothel became a stage, and the audience was never just there for company, but for spectacle. The costumes were as important as the movements. Bright fabrics stitched together in mismatched colors, masks painted with wide, suggestive smiles, bells sewn into hems so that every step jingled with invitation. Their gestures were grand, their expressions almost comically bold, designed to hold attention in a room already crowded with distraction. A raised eyebrow could suggest an entire story. A sudden twirl might provoke both applause and offers. Performance itself became a lure, a way of transforming what might otherwise be hidden into something flaunted, playful, and impossible to ignore. Yet here, too, irony seeped in. These performers were condemned publicly from pulpits and in official proclamations. Priests denounced them as corrupters of the soul, and city officials passed ordinances declaring their acts obscene. And still, behind closed doors, those same men who wagged their fingers in the light of day paid for entry to watch them in secret. The louder the condemnation, it seemed, the greater the appetite for the forbidden show. The hypocrisy was palpable, a script played out endlessly. Morality shouted from the stage of power, desire indulged quietly in the audience of shadows. The narrator's tone here dances between playful amusement and pointed critique. There is joy in describing the theatricality, the laughter, the jingling of bells that cut through the smoke-filled air. But there is also a sharpened edge, for behind the laughter lies the reality of how easily society condemned what it could not resist. These performers carried both the admiration of the crowd and the disdain of authority. Their lives lived at the unstable intersection of desire and regulation. Yet these performers were not always safe. Laws and punishments followed them closely. Wherever the lines between performance, intimacy, and survival blurred, the law moved in swiftly, not to erase, but to mark. City ordinances piled restriction upon restriction, a slow layering of rules that reduced human beings to symbols. Clothing bans dictated what could and could not be worn, forbidding bright fabrics or elaborate styles that might make a worker blend in with the rest of the population. Curfews locked them inside quarters at prescribed hours, as if the body itself were property of the city to be stored away when bells tolled. Forced segregation ensured that these women and men occupied distinct spaces, always apart, always visible in their difference. One city, eager to enforce its vision of order, went so far as to dictate colors. Workers were commanded to wear garments of a particular shade, drab yellows or striped cloth, so that even at a distance they could be identified. It was a uniform of humiliation, its purpose not only to regulate, but to brand. To walk through the market in such clothing was to carry shame stitched into every thread, to be reminded with each step that the city demanded their identity be displayed as warning. The emotional weight here cannot be softened. This was humiliation elevated into policy, a cruelty disguised as order. What should have been personal, how one dressed, where one walked, when one rested, was turned into a public declaration of shame. To exist under such rules was to carry a burden designed by others, a daily reminder that one's life was not entirely one's own. It was law, not as protection, but as spectacle, making sure that the vulnerable were not only controlled but exposed. The narrator reflects with bitterness. The statutes claim to preserve morality, but in truth, they functioned as branding. They transformed individuals into walking signs, their very bodies turned into warnings for others. It was not holiness that guided these laws, but economics, ensuring that those marked remained in their place, easy to tax, easy to manage, and impossible to forget. And in branding, profit always hid beneath morality. Among the most disturbing corners of this economy was the trade built around the fetishization of youth and so-called purity. The very idea of virginity became a commodity, whispered about in taverns, demanded by customers, and advertised in subtle, coded ways by those who profited from it. Purity, a quality praised in sermons as sacred and untouchable, was in these districts transformed into one of the most expensive illusions that could be bought. The contradiction was glaring. What society declared holy by day was exploited for coin by night. The weight of this paradox falls heavily. Innocence, the very thing meant to shield, was twisted into a spectacle of desire. For those forced into this role, it was not only degrading but profoundly cruel. Youth was commodified, turned into a price tag, and innocence itself was corrupted the moment it was sold. The city's hypocrisy could not be clearer. Preachers thundered that purity should be guarded above all, while authorities looked the other way, as long as taxes were collected from its sale. Workers in these houses learned quickly that virginity was less a reality and more a performance. Some were pressured to stage it, coached to act shy, to feign reluctance, to play at being untouched. Others were forced outright into such portrayals, their roles dictated by those who owned the ledgers and set the prices. It was theater of the darkest kind, where humanity was hidden behind masks of innocence, crafted for an audience willing to pay. What should have been a private and personal aspect of life was twisted into a cruel parody, reenacted endlessly for profit. The narrator's tone turns grim here, laying bare the hypocrisy without flinching. To sell virginity was not simply another aspect of the trade. It was a profound betrayal of the very values society claimed to uphold. The pretense of purity made the exploitation sharper, for it wrapped violence in the guise of sanctity. What was celebrated as sacred became corrupted. What was demanded in sermons was violated in secret. The contradiction was not hidden. It was lived daily, in rooms where innocence was bought and sold like any other commodity. But acting carried a price, and not just for the performers. The cruelest irony of the market in virginity was that it never ended with a single transaction. What was staged once could be staged again, and then again after that. First times became theater, repeated endlessly for customers who wanted the illusion more than the truth. Curtains were drawn, candles dimmed, and scripts rehearsed, as workers were forced to play the part of innocence over and over until the role itself became unbearable. What should have been a singular experience of intimacy was twisted into a performance repeated night after night, packaged and sold like a play with no end. The narrator lingers here on the brutality hidden beneath that mask of performance. To the audience, the paying customer, it may have seemed convincing. Nervous gestures, stammered words, feigned hesitation. But behind the act was exhaustion, pain, and the grinding knowledge that each show chipped away at dignity. The theater of innocence concealed the reality of exploitation, wrapping cruelty in a costume of fragility. It was not naivety being sold, but the spectacle of its destruction, carried out for coin. Compassion rises naturally at this point, for those caught in this cycle lived lives that rarely allowed them escape. Their labor demanded not only their bodies, but their emotions, their ability to act, to endure, to turn private anguish into something consumable for others. Imagine the weight of such a role, to relive vulnerability endlessly, not as memory, but as a performance demanded by survival. The cruelty was not loud or sudden, it was persistent, eroding the spirit night by night. And yet, the story cannot end only in despair, because even in such cruelty, people clung to survival strategies. Workers learned to rely on one another, to share advice on how to shorten performances, how to feign more convincingly while giving less, how to protect the fragile pieces of themselves from the erosion of constant repetition. Humanity, even when battered, did not vanish. It adapted, searching for ways to endure. Yet even in such cruelty, people clung to survival strategies. Within these walls, survival was never passive. For every cruel rule imposed, every coin extracted, every humiliation written into law, there were small acts of resistance that pushed back, however quietly. Workers stole food from the kitchens, slipping bread into sleeves or hiding bits of meat beneath skirts. Others learned to negotiate with shrewdness, pushing for better terms with certain customers, setting boundaries where none were supposed to exist. Still others feigned illness when exhaustion became unbearable, forcing the house to grant rest, if only to protect its profits. These were not grand rebellions, but they were real. They were sparks of agency in a system designed to extinguish it. Yet no one survived alone. Community among workers became the strongest defense against despair. Debts were quietly pooled and shared. If one could not pay, another might step in to prevent punishment. Clothing was mended together, food divided when someone went hungry. Warnings whispered when the madam's temper or an enforcer's attention grew dangerous. These networks of mutual aid were fragile, invisible to the outside world, but inside, they were lifelines. It was through each other that workers found the strength to endure nights that otherwise might have broken them. The emotional weight here lies in resilience. These were people bound by ledgers, restricted by law, and surrounded by scorn, yet they refused to surrender completely. Their defiance was measured in small gestures, in quiet refusals, in the stubborn insistence on carving out moments of choice. To resist did not always mean escape. It often meant simply surviving another day with some piece of selfhood intact. The narrator's tone, while somber in recognizing the hardships, shifts toward something more quietly hopeful. Even in the harshest conditions, the human will to endure found cracks in the walls and grew there like weeds between stones. These acts of resistance, however small, remind us that exploitation was never met with total submission. Where there was pressure, there was pushback. Where there was cruelty, there was also courage. But survival also meant risk, for secrets could turn deadly. Every so often, the fragile balance inside these painted walls shattered, and the secrets that usually lived in whispers burst into the open. A client's identity might slip through careless talk, a familiar cloak recognized by someone outside, or a worker, pushed too far, might speak a name aloud in anger. What was usually veiled in discretion became public, and when it did, scandal rippled quickly through the city. Markets buzzed with gossip, neighbors leaned close to repeat half-truths, and suddenly everyone seemed to know which councilman or merchant had passed too often through the forbidden door. In these rare moments, power shifted. For once, it was not the worker under scrutiny, but the patron. The knowledge they carried, the recognition of a face, the memory of a night, became leverage. A threat unspoken could still bend negotiations, ease debts, or force silence from men who otherwise commanded the city. For a fleeting moment, those at the bottom of the hierarchy held something the wealthy feared: exposure. The stage was reversed, and the audience of shame shifted from the worker to the man who paid to enter. But such reversals rarely lasted. Retaliation came swiftly, driven not only by individual pride, but by the machinery of the city itself. Workers who revealed too much, or were merely suspected of it, found themselves dragged before officials, accused of slander or disorderly conduct. Some were thrown into prison cells, their debts doubled in punishment. Others were banished entirely, forced out of the city walls with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And in darker cases, disappearances whispered of punishments carried out in silence, where neither trial nor record remained. The message was always the same: those who dared to expose the powerful paid dearly for it. The tone here shifts from suspense to tragedy, for the cycle is painfully clear. Secrets offered a momentary spark of resistance, but the flame was quickly stamped out. The city ensured that even scandal could not upset the balance for long. Reputation, wealth, and authority shielded those in power, while the vulnerable carried the cost of revelation. It was a game rigged from the start, where exposure was fatal not to the guilty, but to those who spoke it aloud. And always, the city made sure the wealthy emerged untouched. Consider how justice was measured in these streets, and the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. A worker accused of theft, perhaps slipping a coin from a distracted patron's purse, or holding back a portion of the night's earnings, could expect swift and brutal punishment. She might be stripped of her garments and paraded through the market square, her shame turned into public entertainment. Fines would be heaped upon her, debts multiplied, and the weight of humiliation pressed down until her spirit broke. Now contrast this with the fate of a noble client caught in far graver offenses. A man of wealth who refused to pay, who struck a worker in violence, or who was discovered in flagrant breach of curfew, would not find himself in stocks or paraded before jeering crowds. Instead, his punishment might be a discreet warning from a city official, a quiet fee paid behind closed doors, or simply nothing at all. His reputation, his name, his power, his coin, formed a shield so impenetrable that even law bent away from him. The inequality of penalties was written not only in the statutes, but in the very structure of enforcement. Guards stationed outside the quarter knew better than to lay hands on the wealthy, for their salaries depended on the same treasury filled by those men's taxes. Clerks copied records in which the names of nobles rarely appeared, as though omission itself were another form of privilege. What was deemed criminal for the poor was tolerated for the rich. What was unforgivable in one body was excused in another. The narrator's tone sharpens here, bitter and cutting, laying bare the hypocrisy of a system that dressed itself in virtue while practicing favoritism. Justice was not blind in the medieval city. Her eyes were wide open, carefully trained to recognize the difference between rags and silk. Where poverty was met with humiliation, wealth was met with silence, and the system endured because it was designed to endure, feeding off those with the least power while protecting those who ensured its survival. Still, despite injustice, these houses became engines of economy. To think of these houses as isolated places is to miss the full scale of their impact. The coins that changed hands inside did not stay within those painted walls. They rippled outward, feeding entire networks of trade. Breweries thrived on the constant demand for ale and wine. Their barrels rolled nightly through side streets to keep the cups filled. Laundries prospered too, scrubbing soiled linens until their hands were raw, then delivering stacks of fresh sheets back into the houses that would soil them again. Tailors and clothing makers stitched gowns, cloaks, and slippers, garments meant to dazzle briefly beneath candlelight before wearing thin and needing to be replaced. And beyond these trades, the taverns nearby found themselves bustling. Patrons rarely went straight home after their visits. They drifted into alehouses, ordering more drink, sometimes meals, always bringing their chatter and their coin. Tavern keepers knew well that their busiest nights coincided with the hum of activity at the brothel down the lane. The quarter was not just a district of sex, it was an economic ecosystem, one that stretched into every corner of the surrounding city. The irony is sharp. Society condemned the workers, branded them as immoral, restricted their clothing, and paraded them in humiliation when it suited the law. Yet the same society welcomed their money with open arms. The brewer did not ask where the coin came from, nor did the laundress, nor the tavern keeper. Condemnation fell on the labor, not on the profit. And so the contradiction deepened. A city that denounced vice could not survive without the trade it produced. The narrator's tone turns biting as this hypocrisy is laid bare. Condemn the hands that earned it, but grasp the coin they carried. This was the unwritten rule of the marketplace. The workers themselves were shunned, but their wages circulated freely, touching nearly every industry and family in the city. In the end, morality stopped where profit began, and everyone knew it. And one building in particular shows this contradiction vividly. If the brothel itself was a stage, then the tavern-brothel hybrid was an entire carnival crammed under one roof. Imagine a great hall that could not decide what it wanted to be. Was it a drinking den, a gambling parlor, or a house of desire? In truth, it was all of these at once. Lanterns swung from beams darkened by smoke, benches were crammed shoulder to shoulder, and the air trembled with the collision of laughter, shouting, and the clatter of mugs against wood. Disorder was not the exception here. It was the very atmosphere, humming in every corner. The senses were quickly overwhelmed. Ale sloshed across tables and dripped onto the floor, where it mingled with straw meant to soak up spills long since saturated. Dice rattled endlessly, their tumbling punctuated by curses or cries of triumph. A fiddler in the corner tried to cut through the noise with a tune, only to be drowned out by voices singing bawdy songs off-key. Arguments sparked as quickly as they faded, over cards, over debts, over who sat too close or laughed too loudly. In the midst of it all, workers moved from table to table, their laughter forced bright against the chaos, guiding patrons from ale to intimacy as though it were the most natural of transitions. The narrator lingers here on the chaotic energy, painting it not as glamorous, but as relentless. Every sound competed with another. Every moment teetered between revelry and riot. Patrons came not only for drink or company, but for the sheer rush of a space where rules blurred into background noise. It was a place where inhibitions dissolved quickly, where the boundaries between patron and worker, between game and quarrel, between celebration and violence, thinned to near nothing. The tone turns amused, for there is something almost theatrical in the bedlam of the scene, a parody of civility where mugs and dice replaced decorum. But beneath the humor lies critique, because such spaces were tinderboxes. Exploitation was easier to mask when buried beneath noise, and violence was never more than a heartbeat away. The tavern-brothel hybrid was profitable, yes, but it was also volatile, an experiment in excess that often demanded intervention. And into this chaos stepped the city guards. As the tavern-brothel hybrid roared with noise, the streets outside carried a different rhythm, the measured steps of the night watch. Watchmen moved in small groups, lanterns swaying in their hands, their light stretching long shadows across the cobblestones. Keys rattled at their belts, cudgels swung at their sides, and their voices called out the hours as if order could be sung into being. To some, their presence offered reassurance. To others, it was a warning. The glow of their lanterns meant that no secret could be safely kept in the open air, but the enforcement of law, as always, was far from equal. A wealthy man caught stumbling drunkenly through the street after leaving a brothel might receive a polite escort home, his dignity preserved, his misstep quietly erased. A poor worker, by contrast, could be seized for the smallest infraction. Too loud a laugh, too late a walk, too little coin to pay a bribe. Justice in the night was not blind, but sharp-eyed, always quick to recognize the difference between velvet and rags. The arrests themselves carried a strange theatricality. A scuffle outside a tavern would draw watchmen instantly, their lanterns raised high as they dragged the accused into the street. The noise would ripple outward, and soon neighbors leaned from windows, children darted barefoot to watch, and crowds gathered in the glow of torchlight. The arrested became performers in an unwanted play, pushed and shouted at, their humiliation offered as entertainment for the sleepless city. The guards knew their role well. Punishment was not just about maintaining order, but about staging it for all to see. The narrator's tone turns sardonic here, for the irony is hard to miss. The watchmen claimed to safeguard the peace, yet what they often produced was spectacle, ensuring that fear and curiosity mingled in equal measure. It was not justice, but theater, played nightly on cobblestones lit by swinging lanterns. And arrests were not always about crime, but about spectacle. By day as well as night, the city never missed a chance to turn discipline into display. Humiliation was not carried out in silence, but staged for an audience, carefully arranged so that punishment became a kind of performance. To the authorities, it was a lesson. To the people, it was entertainment. In the end, it blurred into something disturbingly theatrical, where cruelty masqueraded as morality. Pillories and stocks were among the most common props on this stage. Offenders were locked into them in the busiest parts of the city, market squares, near churches, along the main roads, where no one could miss the sight. Their heads and hands were held fast by heavy beams of wood, their backs bent at awkward angles, leaving them exposed to the jeers and taunts of the crowd. Children threw scraps of food, men spat insults, women gossiped openly, all while the offender endured hours under the public gaze. Parades carried the same intent. Offenders forced to march barefoot through the streets, mocked and harassed until their very steps became part of the punishment. The emotional weight of these spectacles is heavy, for beneath the noise lies a cruelty that was deliberate. The purpose was never only to discipline, it was to degrade. What might have been handled in private became a display meant to reaffirm the city's claim to authority. The body of the punished became a canvas, painted with shame for all to see. To the crowd, it was a temporary diversion. To the one enduring it, it was a lifetime of scars, both physical and invisible. The narrator's voice lowers here, grim in its reflection. Punishment as theater was not justice, it was control. It allowed the city to remind its people that law could touch anyone, that no one stood outside its reach, except, of course, those wealthy enough to escape its grasp. What passed as moral correction was often no more than sanctioned cruelty, dressed up in the language of virtue, but rooted in spectacle and fear. Even manuals of the time carried this mixture of instruction and cruelty. If the city streets staged punishment as theater, then the libraries and pulpits of the age offered their own strange scripts. Manuals, pamphlets, and sermons circulated with an air of authority, presenting themselves as guides for how one ought to live, love, and control the body. Some were written by physicians, others by clerics, still others by anonymous scribes who blended folklore with fragments of classical learning. To modern eyes, their advice often borders on the absurd, yet in their time these texts were treated with gravity, consulted as if they held the keys to virtue and health alike. Their prescriptions could be laughable. One guide recommended that men chew parsley daily to prevent lustful dreams. Another insisted that women wear amulets made from dried animal parts to guard their purity. Potions promised to banish desire altogether, brewed from concoctions so vile, ashes, bitter roots, ground insects, that simply drinking them might drive passion from anyone's mind. There were rituals too. Bathe at a certain hour under a certain moon, walk backward around a church 3 times, or whisper prayers into a jug of water before drinking. Each instruction was written with solemn certainty, as if human longing could be managed through herbs, charms, and half-remembered superstitions. The narrator allows a playful tone here, smiling at the absurdity of such remedies. It is easy to imagine medieval households earnestly following these rituals, repeating them faithfully despite their futility. Yet beneath the humor lies something more telling. These guides reveal not only superstition, but also deep anxiety. The fear of disease especially haunted every word. The threat of infection lingered in the background of every ritual, driving people to cling to any promise of protection, no matter how far-fetched. The obsession with control, of the body, of desire, of women in particular, ran like a current beneath the surface of all these texts. By turning intimacy into something that had to be prescribed and monitored, these guides did more than amuse. They reveal how power worked. What could not be controlled through law was reined in through fear, dressed up as wisdom. The absurdity, then, is not harmless. It speaks to a world desperate to manage what it did not understand, willing to trade freedom for rituals that offered only the illusion of safety. Fear, however, had its darkest form in witch trials. Fear has a way of spreading faster than reason, and in the medieval city, suspicion could leap from one whispered rumor to a formal accusation in the blink of an eye. A glance interpreted as strange, an herbal remedy brewed for a cough, a customer who fell ill after a visit. Any of these could ignite the spark of accusation. What began as gossip in a tavern might, by morning, become the certainty of guilt carried to the magistrate's door. For women in brothels, the danger was especially sharp. Already marked by society as fallen, they were easy targets when the city's anxieties demanded an outlet. If crops failed, if plague struck, if misfortune lingered too long, suspicion often pointed to those who were both visible and vulnerable. Workers were accused of brewing potions, not for comfort, but for curses, of speaking charms not to heal but to harm. Their labor, already branded immoral, became recast as sorcery, their mere existence proof enough for those eager to find blame. The hysteria fed itself. One accusation led to another, and fear spread like fire in dry straw. Crowds gathered outside doors, murmurs grew into shouts, and officials, eager to prove their vigilance, often acted swiftly rather than risk appearing lax. Once the label of witchcraft was spoken aloud, it rarely dissolved. Instead, it clung, heavy and inescapable. Fear magnified until it consumed both the accused and the accuser, a frenzy that left little room for truth. The narrator's tone here is tense, heavy, weighed down by the knowledge of what such fear unleashed. It was not justice, but panic, dressed in the trappings of law, a cycle in which reason surrendered to terror. Workers who had little power in life found even less in accusation, caught in storms they could not control, and once accused, the outcome was rarely merciful. The halls of justice in the medieval city were rarely places of fairness. They were theaters of fear. Imagine a dim, drafty chamber where stone walls magnified every sound, where a wooden bench served as the seat of judgment, and stern-faced officials sat in their robes, ready to pronounce verdicts long before testimony began. At the center stood the accused, often a woman from the brothel district, her hands shaking, her voice faltering, her very posture betraying the weight of the room. She faced not a trial in the modern sense, but a ritual meant to confirm guilt already assumed. The evidence presented was almost always flimsy. drawn more from rumor than fact. A neighbor claimed to have seen her whispering in the night. A patron, embarrassed or angry, insisted she had bewitched him. A sudden illness or a failed harvest was tied to her presence, as though misfortune itself could be placed upon her shoulders. Testimonies contradicted one another, but the contradictions were rarely questioned. The mere existence of multiple voices was treated as proof, no matter how hollow their words. Sentences were swift and severe. Exile was the most merciful, forcing the accused beyond the city gates with nothing but what she could carry, condemned to wander without safety or home. More often, the outcomes were harsher: public flogging, branding, or execution by fire. The punishments were staged to make examples, not to deliver justice. In the eyes of the city, her suffering served as a warning to others. Her body turned into a message carved against the fear of disorder. The emotional weight of these trials rests in their helplessness. The accused rarely had advocates, rarely had any chance to defend herself against the tidal wave of suspicion. To stand in that courtroom was to feel the inevitability of condemnation, to sense that no word or tear could alter the script already written. Her fate had been decided long before she entered the hall, sealed by fear and the city's need for control. The narrator's tone lingers in grave reflection, recognizing the cruelty of a system that wore the mask of law but dealt in hysteria. Justice, as practiced here, was less about truth than about reassurance for the fearful, a ritual sacrifice to quiet the anxieties of the community. And in that grim cycle, mercy rarely found a place. But even amid persecution, some forged solidarity. Even in the harshest corners of the city, where punishment loomed and suspicion stalked the night, people found ways to cling to one another. The narrator's tone softens here, shifting from the weight of trials and fire to something more tender, more human. Survival in such a world was not a solitary act. It was shared, built quietly in bonds that no ordinance could erase. In the cramped quarters of the brothel or the shadowed alleys behind it, friendships formed that became lifelines. A worker who had gone hungry was given a crust of bread by another who had managed to hide a piece. When patrols prowled the streets, warnings were whispered from door to door. Stay inside tonight. The watch is restless. Some helped one another hide from punishments, slipping into lofts or cellars when danger drew too near. These acts, small in the eyes of the city, meant everything in the lives of those who endured them. Such networks of care stitched together resilience from scraps. There was laughter shared too, fleeting moments of joy carved out between long nights of labor, stories told in whispers, songs hummed softly, even small jokes that momentarily dissolved the weight of the world. These gestures did not erase the exploitation or the fear, but they reminded each person that she was not entirely alone, that within the walls designed to confine, solidarity could still breathe. The emotional tone is tender, humanizing, a pause in the relentless cycle of shame and punishment. It offers a glimpse of the resilience of spirit, the insistence on humanity, even in places built to deny it. These were the quiet rebellions that no ledger could measure, and no guard could crush. The simple, stubborn act of caring for one another. These bonds sometimes blossomed into love, though hidden. In the shadows of the city, where the painted doorways and candlelit rooms were meant to strip people of individuality, something unexpected grew. Connections that defied the roles assigned to them. Not every bond formed in those spaces was transactional, nor did every act of intimacy follow the pattern society permitted. Quietly, in gestures often unnoticed by outsiders, networks of same-sex companionship and love began to take shape. They were fragile, yes, but they were also profound, lifelines woven in secrecy. These relationships were never displayed openly. They existed in glances held too long, in laughter that carried double meaning, in touches that passed as casual but carried the weight of tenderness. A worker might linger in another's room after a long night, sharing warmth not demanded by any customer, but chosen freely. Such intimacy was survival as much as affection, a reminder that in a world eager to brand them as objects, they still had the power to choose, to love, to create moments of humanity. secrecy was essential. Coded behavior became a language all its own. Shared songs with hidden meanings, borrowed tokens passed from one to another, private stories exchanged under the cover of noise. These were the shields that allowed queer bonds to exist in a city that would never tolerate them openly. To the outside world, nothing seemed unusual. To those within the network, every gesture mattered. It was a form of survival as much as intimacy, and secrecy itself became a form of protection. The narrator's voice here is gentle, almost reverent, for these connections deserve dignity rather than spectacle. They were not curiosities or scandals, but acts of resistance against a world that denied them recognition. By carving out spaces for companionship and love, queer networks reasserted humanity in the most hostile of environments. They proved that even within exploitation, people found ways to define themselves, not by the city's rules, but by their own. Yet secrecy, while protective, carried its own dangers. For what was hidden could also be twisted, used as a weapon in times of accusation or betrayal. But secrecy itself could be used against them. What had once been a fragile sanctuary could, in the wrong moment, be transformed into a weapon. The same hidden glances, the same whispered affection that sustained lives in the shadows, might suddenly be recast as evidence of sin. In a world eager to condemn, even tenderness could be twisted into proof. What for two people was love or survival became, in the hands of accusers, a crime. Accusations did not need substance, only suggestion. A rival might whisper of unnatural bonds, a bitter client might claim to have seen gestures never made, or a neighbor might repeat idle gossip until it hardened into certainty. Once spoken, the words carried weight, magnifying the danger. What was private became public, and the secrecy that once protected now trapped, for it offered no defense against suspicion. The very need to hide was treated as evidence of guilt. Here, the narrator's voice trembles with a sense of heartbreak. Imagine love, already fragile and hidden, becoming the blade that cuts you down. Betrayal could come from outside or from within, as fear drove people to speak against one another to save themselves. In these moments, the human cost is unbearable. Intimacy turned to shame, companionship used as chains, trust dissolved under the pressure of survival. The tragedy lies not only in punishment, but in the way fear stripped dignity from something so deeply human. The tone progression is stark, warmth in the memory of quiet bonds, anxiety in the threat of exposure, and finally tragedy in the collapse of safety. Love, which should have been shield and refuge, became instead the spark for condemnation. And so, the noose of law tightened further. The reach of law did not remain confined to the brothel walls or the narrow alleys of the quarter. Over time, ordinances grew broader, stretching their grip over nearly every aspect of daily life. What began as regulation of sex soon spread into rules governing how one spoke, what one wore, and even where one could gather. A laugh in the wrong place might be deemed indecent. A cloak too fine or too bright might be declared forbidden. Even groups of friends meeting in the evening could be branded as a disorderly crowd. The net of morality was cast wide, and it ensnared more than those who had been its original target. For ordinary people, this meant living under constant scrutiny. The sound of watchmen's boots could silence a conversation mid-sentence. The approach of a clerk or official might force someone to lower their eyes or quicken their steps. What had once been considered harmless pleasures, music, dancing, gossip in the street, suddenly carried risk. A word too loud, a gesture too bold, a gathering too cheerful could all become grounds for accusation. The city's promise of order came not through protection, but through suffocation, pressing down on daily life until it was shaped by fear. The narrator's tone, at first restrained and careful, shifts toward frustration. The absurdity of it all is impossible to ignore. Laws written in the name of virtue, stripped joy from existence, branding laughter and color as dangerous. The atmosphere grew heavy, as though the air itself was policed. People moved cautiously, carrying the weight of invisible rules on their shoulders, knowing that even innocence could be painted as guilt when viewed through the eyes of authority. By the end, the tone sharpens into condemnation. These ordinances were not about morality at all, but about control, tools wielded to remind people of their vulnerability, to keep them compliant under the pretense of righteousness. When every act can be branded a crime, the law ceases to protect and instead becomes a weapon. And weapons, when used too often, invite resistance. And in such suffocation, riots returned. Once more, the city's streets filled not with quiet footfalls or hushed whispers, but with the roar of collective anger. Torches flickered in the night, their flames mirrored in the glint of broken glass and shattered shutters. Chants rose from the crowd, voices rough with fury, carrying grievances that had built for months, even years. Doors of tavern brothel hybrids were battered down with makeshift clubs, windows smashed with stones, and the painted signs that once lured patrons were torn to splinters. The quarter, so often a place of controlled indulgence, became the stage for chaos, its order overturned by the very people it had long contained. The roots of this revolt were not mysterious. Taxes weighed heavily, drawn from the same pockets already drained to maintain the city's spectacles of morality. Restrictions piled endlessly, curfews and clothing bans pressing down until daily life itself felt unbearable. Resentment simmered not just within the brothel walls, but among townsfolk who saw in these ordinances a reflection of their own suffocation. When anger finally broke its boundaries, the brothel district became the target. Not because it caused the grievances, but because it symbolized them. To burn it was to strike at the hypocrisy of a city that profited from sin while pretending to condemn it. The clashes that followed were fierce. Guards rushed into the narrow lanes, their lanterns swinging wildly as they fought to push back the mob. Stones met shields, torches met cudgels, and the cobblestones echoed with screams of both defiance and pain. The smoke of burning timbers choked the air, mingling with the cries of those driven back or struck down. What began as anger turned into melee, and the night dissolved into confusion, the line between rebel and victim blurring in the chaos. Yet when dawn came, the outcome was grimly predictable. Ashes cooled, broken doors were replaced, and the very same buildings that had been torched in rage were reconstructed, often with the same labor and the same coins as before. The cycle repeated itself endlessly: destruction, punishment, rebuilding. The system did not collapse under fire. It absorbed it, rebuilt itself, and carried on as though revolt were simply another cost of business. The narrator's tone, caught first in the whirlwind of chaos, settles into ironic resignation. Each uprising felt like a rupture, a breaking point, yet history showed otherwise. Rebellion flared, burned brightly, and then died, leaving the city's contradictions intact. The futility of it all lay heavy, as though the revolt itself had become another performance, one whose ending was already written. And amid fire and ash, belief in punishment still burned. Step back for a moment, and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Condemnation from the pulpit, profit counted in the treasury, rebellion flaring in the streets, then rebuilding to start it all again. It was less a system of morality than a machine, grinding forward on predictable gears, turning endlessly without ever breaking. Sin was denounced, sin was taxed, sin was punished, and sin was quietly welcomed back, because too many hands depended on its coin. The narrator's tone grows edged with cynicism, for the truth is plain. City officials did not simply tolerate this cycle. They orchestrated it. They wrote the rules that criminalized, collected the revenues that enriched, and deployed the guards who suppressed. Every sermon against immorality served as a curtain, behind which accounts were balanced, and new ordinances drafted to tighten control. The pretense of virtue was little more than grease for the machine's wheels. And yet this was no harmless contradiction. The consequences were borne by flesh and blood, by the workers dragged into courtrooms, by the poor paraded through streets, by those accused of witchcraft for nothing more than surviving on the margins. The machine ran on their suffering, and the cycle of hypocrisy ensured it would never run short of fuel. The narrator's voice turns foreboding as the chapter closes. For if cycles of hypocrisy and revolt were grim, What came next was darker still. The same machinery that taxed and punished would soon turn fully toward persecution, feeding the fire of witch hunts and morality crusades that left whole communities scarred. And after the firestorm, there would come only silence, a quiet close of the night heavy with loss. This prepares the way for Block 3, the climax of persecution and the quiet close of the night. The night of chaos had burned itself out, leaving the city in a hollow silence. Dawn crept cautiously across the cobblestones, its pale light spilling over streets still marked by overturned barrels, broken glass, and the faint smell of smoke. Where hours before there had been shouting, music, and fire, there was now only the slow drip of water from rooftops and the shuffle of tired feet. The city inhaled again, weary from its own excess, as if afraid to disturb the fragile quiet left behind. The narrator's tone lowers here, almost a whisper, as if to match the fragile mood of mourning. Indulgence always carried an aftertaste, and now it lingered in the air. Patrons who had slipped home under cover of darkness left behind their traces, coins dropped in haste, spilled wine staining doorsteps, a cloak forgotten in a corner. With the sun rising, these remnants felt less like pleasures and more like evidence, quiet reminders of the things society condemned but never stopped seeking. Alongside this unease came the other residue, fear. Fear of who might have been seen, of what rumors might be whispered in markets, of which names might slip into the hands of officials before the day was done. Inside the houses, the work of recovery had already begun. Workers swept floors still sticky with ale, gathered broken cups, and washed the sheets that told too much. Some nursed bruises or cuts from arguments that had turned violent, while others pressed cool cloths to tired eyes. Yet even amid exhaustion, there was no time to rest. The cycle demanded readiness, for tonight would bring the same songs, the same games, the same trade, as though nothing had happened at all. It was survival, carried out with aching bones and practiced hands, a rhythm too well known to break. The emotional beat strikes hardest here, exhaustion mixed with inevitability. Those who lived within this cycle knew its weight intimately. Each morning carried the same truth, that what had broken them in the night would return again tomorrow. There was no pause long enough to heal, no silence deep enough to grant peace. There was only the weary preparation for repetition. The narrator ends with quiet resignation, letting the weariness hang before tilting toward what lies ahead. For while the streets cooled in the early light, another heat was already rising. Not the flames of riot, but the slow burning fire of accusation, ready to consume with even greater cruelty. Yet even as streets cooled, the machinery of accusation heated up. In the uneasy quiet that followed nights of revelry and riot, another kind of trade flourished, one that dealt not in coin, but in words. Rumors themselves became a form of currency, whispered across market stalls, carried through alleyways, passed from lips eager to protect themselves by pointing elsewhere. In this economy of suspicion, an accusation could buy safety, or at least delay danger. Neighbors turned on neighbors with calculated precision. A woman accused another of stirring strange herbs, hoping to draw attention away from her own dealings. A man denounced his rival as a frequenter of brothels, seeking to ruin his reputation while preserving his own. The logic was cruel but simple. Better that someone else bear the weight of scrutiny than oneself. In this way, fear fueled betrayal, and betrayal became routine. The authorities did not simply tolerate this climate, they thrived on it. Every denunciation gave them reason to intervene, to assert their presence, to levy fines and exact control. Suspicion filled their coffers as surely as taxes did. It was far easier to govern a city where people policed each other with gossip than to rely on watchmen alone. And so, the cycle of fear deepened, self-perpetuating, every whisper sharpening into a weapon. The narrator's tone here is tense, nearly paranoid, mirroring the atmosphere of the time. Imagine living in a world where even silence was dangerous, where speaking too little might mark you as complicit, and speaking too much might turn your words against you. In such a place, trust frayed until nearly nothing was left, and suspicion became the only currency that mattered, and suspicion fell heaviest on those already marked. The city found endless ways to make sure its outcasts could never be mistaken for anyone else. Ordinances required that certain people, especially women of the brothel quarters, wear visible marks of their status. Badges stitched onto sleeves, scarves of regulated colors, or striped fabrics were forced into their wardrobes. In some places, shoes of a particular style or head coverings of a certain hue became compulsory. These were not garments chosen by the wearer, but symbols imposed by authority, walking proclamations of shame. The result was immediate and cruel. To step outside, even for errands as ordinary as buying bread or fetching water, meant to be instantly identifiable. The mark announced who you were before you could speak, stripping away the possibility of blending into the crowd. Strangers stared, children mocked, and merchants took advantage, charging more because they knew you had no place to argue. There was no escape from visibility, no refuge in anonymity. The city had branded its outcasts not with fire or iron, but with cloth and color, and the effect was no less permanent. The narrator lingers on the emotional weight of this erasure. These marks did more than signal occupation. They erased individuality. A woman became not herself, but a category, a symbol for others to condemn. Her story, her family, her small acts of survival were swallowed whole by the color of her cloak or the badge on her sleeve. It was a quiet violence, enacted daily, grinding dignity away, not through blows, but through relentless exposure. The tone deepens from observant to sorrowful, and finally to condemning. To mark a human being so visibly was not about morality, it was about control. Branding was a way for the city to keep its order visible, to remind everyone where power lay and who bore the weight of shame. It turned the streets into stages of inequality, with the marked bodies forced to play roles they never chose. But branding did not erase humanity, it forced it underground. When the city branded its outcasts with marks meant to strip away individuality, those within the margins responded by weaving new identities in secret. Out of necessity, they created languages the authorities could not read. A glance held a beat longer than usual, a gesture disguised as habit, a phrase twisted into double meaning. These became the grammar of survival. What was forbidden in plain speech could be shared safely through signals invisible to outsiders. Slang flourished in the quarters, a vocabulary born not from books, but from lived experience. Words bent into new shapes, their meanings understood only by those who needed them. A nickname might disguise an identity, a song verse could warn of patrols, a joke could carry a serious instruction. Even clothing, when the law dictated colors, became a code. A ribbon tied this way, or a hem stitched differently meant something to those who looked closely. These codes were more than clever tricks. They were lifelines. A whispered signal might save someone from arrest, a gesture could warn of an enforcer's anger, a shared phrase might invite solidarity in the face of humiliation. Through them, workers resisted the total erasure imposed on them. They reminded one another, "We are more than what the badge says, more than what the law declares." The narrator's tone here warms with admiration, highlighting the quiet ingenuity that allowed dignity to survive under constant pressure. It is a reminder that resistance does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it winks, sometimes it hides in plain sight. These hidden languages were fragile yet powerful, keeping humanity alive in spaces designed to crush it. And so the section closes with a hopeful note. Even in oppression, creativity and solidarity flourished in the shadows. And those codes carried through even as flames of witch trials grew higher. The hysteria that had been simmering for years now reached its terrible peak. The city squares, once filled with merchants and markets, became stages for a different kind of gathering. Bonfires built not for warmth, but for execution. Great stacks of timber rose in the center of the square, tied together with ropes and splashed with pitch. The crowd pressed in from every side, their faces lit in orange glow, anticipation humming through them like electricity. This was not justice in any true sense. It was theater of fear, staged for the masses. One by one, the condemned were marched forward, shackled, shamed, their garments torn or marked to declare their sins. They walked the gauntlet of jeering townsfolk. Some spat, some shouted prayers, others laughed as if this were festival rather than death. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to see more clearly. Vendors sold food at the edge of the square, and the line between spectacle and atrocity blurred until it vanished entirely. The city framed these moments as triumphs of righteousness, but what filled the air was not holiness. It was cruelty, masquerading as virtue. The flames rose, and the crowd roared as though victory had been achieved. Officials spoke of cleansing the city, of rooting out corruption, of defending faith. But beneath their words lay another truth. This violence reassured the fearful, distracted them from deeper inequalities, and reminded them of the power of those who ruled. To burn a woman in the square was to make an example, a warning to all others. Stay in your place, keep your head bowed, or you may be next. The narrator's tone here is horrified, then tragic, and finally sharp with indictment. These were not acts of divine justice, but calculated cruelty disguised as piety. Entire lives were erased in smoke while crowds cheered, convinced they were participants in moral victory. The city, meanwhile, clothed itself in righteousness while feeding its own appetite for control. And yet, behind the flames, something colder continued without pause: the counting of coins. But behind the flames, city officials still counted coins. For all the fiery sermons, the thundering proclamations, and the public cries of righteousness, the machinery of persecution was never only about belief. It was also about profit. Each accusation, each trial, each execution carried with it a price that someone paid, and that the city collected. Fines were levied at every stage of the process, for failing to appear promptly before the court, for attempting to defend oneself too boldly, for families begging to shorten a sentence, or to claim a body after the flames. Confiscated goods filled the treasuries as well. When a woman was condemned, her meager possessions were seized: a trunk of clothing, a handful of coins, perhaps a small piece of jewelry saved over years of hardship. Nobles accused of moral failings lost property too, though their punishments rarely reached the fire. Still, their estates conveniently changed hands, enriching officials and their allies. Even the wood for the bonfires was not wasted. Its cost was charged back to the condemned's family, a cruel reminder that death itself was billable. The system, in truth, fed itself. The more accusations circulated, the more wealth flowed into coffers. Fear was converted into currency, suspicion into revenue, punishment into profit. Morality was preached in lofty tones, but beneath the robes of the judges and the banners of the church, this was business. Cold, calculating, efficient. The narrator's tone bites with irony. A city that proclaimed itself holy profited most when its people were consumed by terror. The spectacle of persecution, framed as divine justice, was in practice little more than another market, where suffering was bought and sold, and where the balance sheet always came out in favor of those already powerful. And even after death, business went on inside the houses. When the smoke of the trials cleared and the ashes were swept from the public squares, the city did what it always did. It carried on. Horror and spectacle, fire and judgment. None of it halted the rhythm that beat beneath the cobblestones. By nightfall, the brothel doors opened again. Lanterns glowed in windows, and footsteps echoed down the narrow streets as though nothing had happened at all. The condemned were gone, but the demand remained, and the cycle resumed with unshaken inevitability. Rooms still filled. Patrons returned, some with curiosity, others with guilt, many with no hesitation whatsoever. The same songs were sung, the same dice rolled, the same promises whispered in the dark. Outside, guards made their rounds, watchful but complicit. Inside, the madam tallied her ledgers, deducting for rent, food, and fines, ensuring the coins still flowed upward. The very institutions that had orchestrated bonfires of judgment now stretched out their hands for their share of taxes, as if morality burned only long enough to balance the books. The emotional sting comes in the shocking normalcy. One might expect silence, shame, or at least hesitation in the wake of executions, but the city revealed itself instead as unshakably pragmatic. Fear lingered, yes, but not enough to close the doors, not enough to pause the profits. Survival for some, indulgence for others, revenue for the officials. All of it continued as though persecution had been nothing more than another entry in the city's calendar. The narrator's tone shifts from cynical to resigned, settling into the steady cadence of repetition. Life inside and outside the houses showed the same truth. Horror was absorbed, normalized, folded back into routine. The cycle was a machine too well-oiled to stop, even by fire, until plague itself forced the doors shut. The rhythm that had seemed unbreakable finally faltered when plague crept into the city. Where once the nights rang with drunken laughter and clattering dice, silence now pressed against the shuttered doors. The painted signs that had long lured patrons stood weathered and unused, their colors fading beneath dust and rain. Streets that had glowed with lanterns and torchlight became empty corridors, echoes swallowed by fear. For the first time in living memory, the cycle of indulgence and profit was forced to a halt, not by law or riot, but by disease. The fear of contagion was merciless. Entire districts were closed off, doors nailed shut, alleys barricaded. Patrons vanished overnight, fleeing to safer quarters or locking themselves within their homes. Watchmen no longer patrolled for order, but to enforce isolation, ensuring that no one crossed into or out of the abandoned lanes. What had once been a neighborhood of noise and life turned into a hollowed shell, marked by silence and the faint stench of sickness that carried on the wind. For the workers inside, there was little refuge. Many were abandoned, left without coin, without protection, without medicine. Those who fell ill found themselves shut away, their cries unanswered, their bodies removed only after death. In a city already practiced in turning away from its outcasts, the plague only deepened abandonment. Where once humiliation had been staged for the crowd, now devastation unfolded in solitude, with no audience but the rats and the silence. The emotional beat here is devastation. The narrator lingers on the crushing sense of erasure. Not only lives lost, but entire communities left to rot behind their own doors. The city, which had long exploited their labor, now left them to their fate when profit could no longer be drawn from them. It is a bleak moment, heavy with the knowledge that survival itself was reduced to chance. And yet, as history shows, even plague was not strong enough to end demand forever. Yet even plague could not end demand forever. When the plague loosened its grip and the city dared to breathe again, the forbidden doors creaked open once more. It did not happen suddenly, with fanfare or noise, but cautiously, as though the buildings themselves remembered the silence and feared it might return. Lanterns were lit again, though fewer than before. The painted signs were repainted, their colors still damp with fresh strokes of red and gold, a defiant attempt to mask the rot that lingered beneath. Yet even as the district stirred back to life, new rules and fees weighed heavily on those who remained. Officials saw opportunity in the reopening, drafting regulations that demanded fresh taxes, tighter restrictions, and steeper penalties. The machine had been paused, but now it returned hungrier than ever. Business resumed because it had to. For workers left destitute by months of disease, there was no other choice. Starvation forced many back to the benches, the back rooms, the beds. Patrons returned too, some hesitantly, others with barely a pause, their desires stronger than their memories of sickness. The cycle of survival and indulgence reassembled itself with brutal efficiency. What had been silenced by plague was resurrected by necessity, not joy. The emotional weight lies in this paradox: resilience mixed with tragedy. There was strength in those who endured, in the way they rebuilt, shattered routines and carried on with what little they had left. Yet there was also a bleakness, a recognition that survival often demanded returning to the very spaces that had already broken them. The reopening was not a triumph. It was a weary continuation, marked by losses that could never truly be mended. The narrator's tone reflects this progression, cautious at the beginning, practical in the acknowledgement of survival, and weary in the recognition of tragedy. Life returned, yes, but it was life scarred, diminished, and forever shadowed by what the plague had stolen. But the cycle had left scars that never healed. The cost of the cycle revealed itself most plainly on bodies. Years of labor had left their mark, stooped shoulders, calloused hands, weary eyes that carried shadows deeper than sleepless nights could explain. Disease etched itself into skin, leaving pockmarks and frailty. Injuries from violence or neglect healed badly, lingering as constant reminders of the dangers endured. Age, too, arrived early in these quarters, worn into faces that looked decades older than their years. Survival was possible, but it demanded a price that the body always remembered, and the streets themselves bore scars just as permanent. Doors that had been burned in riots were rebuilt, but the blackened stones at their thresholds told the story. Walls patched with mismatched timber stood as mute witnesses to cycles of destruction and reconstruction. Even the cobblestones seemed to hold memory, grooves deepened by centuries of boots, cartwheels, and torches. The city covered its wounds with plaster and paint, but the marks of fire, plague, and persecution bled through. The emotional beat settles into haunting permanence. Exploitation was not only lived in the moment, it was written into both flesh and stone, reminders that could not be scrubbed away. Those who walked these streets long after still traced the outlines of suffering with every step. The houses themselves, despite their paint and lantern light, carried an air of exhaustion, as though the buildings, too, were weary of the endless cycle. The narrator's tone moves from somber to haunting, and finally to reflective. What endured was not merely the memory of individuals, but the imprint of an entire system, etched into the city's architecture and into the very people who had no choice but to endure it. And the past lingered not only in ruins, but in culture. As years passed, the brothel districts did not vanish from memory. Instead, they seeped into the imagination of the city, woven into its folklore like threads of shadow stitched into everyday tales. Legends emerged, ghostly stories told by firelight of women who lingered long after death, their laughter echoing down alleys at midnight, or their pale faces glimpsed in candlelit windows of houses long abandoned. Parents repeated such stories as cautionary tales, warning children not to wander too close to the painted doors, not to stray from the safe paths home. What had once been a district of noise and commerce became, in memory, a place of haunted thresholds and restless spirits. The narrator lingers on the way these stories morphed into lessons. Ghosts were said to tug at a child's sleeve if they loitered, or to whisper temptations into the ears of young men, dragging them toward ruin. Other tales spoke of cursed coins, money that came from sinful hands and brought misfortune to whoever spent it. In every telling, the past was reshaped into a moral fable, the messy realities of survival stripped away and replaced with myth designed to frighten or instruct. Yet there is an emotional beat here. Memory twisted into myth is not neutral. It both preserved and erased. The suffering, the exploitation, the quiet acts of humanity, all became flattened into shadows and curses. Ghost stories made the workers into symbols, forever haunting, but never understood. What lingered in the imagination was less the truth of their lives, and more the fear and fascination of those who stood outside the painted doors. The tone begins playfully, with the fun of ghost stories and eerie rumors, then turns unsettling as the narrator reflects on how memory distorts. By the end, the voice is reflective, recognizing that while folklore kept the past alive, it did so in ways that obscured the lived realities. The myths revealed less about the women who once worked there and more about the fears of the society that invented them. But behind myth was always reality, lived and suffered. Amid the cruelty, the regulations, and the endless weight of exploitation, there were moments, small, fleeting, but powerful, that revealed another side of life in the shadowed quarters. The The narrator's tone softens here, drawing attention to the quiet acts of kindness that resisted the dehumanization imposed by the city. Though officials sought to brand and punish, individuals found ways to care for one another, carving out brief sanctuaries of compassion in an otherwise merciless world. Neighbors shared what little they had. A crust of bread passed quietly through a doorway, a candle stub gifted when the night felt too dark, a borrowed cloak to ward off the cold walk home. These were not grand gestures, but simple ones, made meaningful by the scarcity surrounding them. They reminded each person that, despite the badges and restrictions, they were still human, still deserving of warmth. Workers, too, cared for one another in sickness. When the city turned away, when plague or injury left someone bedridden, it was often another worker who fetched water, changed sheets, or offered whispered comfort in the night. Medicine might have been scarce, but touch, presence, and solidarity carried their own healing. It was survival rooted not in law or authority, but in shared humanity, in bonds that could not be legislated away. The emotional beat here is bittersweet. These small gestures did not undo the injustice of the system, nor did they erase the suffering endured day after day. Yet they stood as proof that cruelty never had the final word. Even in the darkest corners, humanity persisted, stubborn and unyielding, refusing to be extinguished. The narrator's tone flows gently into warmth, then rests in bittersweet reflection. Kindness was fragile, but real, like a candle burning in the draft of a ruined house, small, flickering, but enough to keep the darkness from becoming absolute. And those small acts remind us of survival, not just suffering. Even as laws pressed down and branding marked the body, another form of memory moved more freely, through song and story. Ballads drifted out of taverns, carried on the breath of drunkards who barely remembered the words, while jokes passed in the marketplace, whispered and then repeated with laughter that was sometimes cruel, sometimes rueful. The margins of the city spoke in rhythm and rhyme, even if the official records sought to erase them. Some of these songs mocked. They turned the lives of workers into caricatures, exaggerating their mannerisms, their dealings, their supposed greed or folly. A woman might be reduced to a punchline, a man who visited her painted as a fool. The humor entertained crowds, but beneath the laughter was scorn, a way of reinforcing the hierarchy by turning survival itself into comedy. The city pretended to laugh at its vices even while it depended on them. But not all voices mocked. Some ballads carried a tone of mourning, telling stories of lost love, betrayal, or death. In them, the figures of the brothel quarter became tragic rather than comic, their suffering sung into verses that carried from one neighborhood to the next. These songs did not always tell the truth, but they carried something closer to sympathy, an acknowledgement, however faint, that those living behind painted doors were also human, also capable of grief and longing. The emotional beat strikes here. Culture preserved voices, even if distorted. Songs and stories gave shape to memory, passing down fragments that might otherwise have been lost. They twisted reality, yes, but they also ensured that the margins could not be entirely silenced. Even when told through irony or ridicule, even when reshaped into tragedy, these cultural echoes refused to let the story of the outcasts vanish completely. The narrator's tone moves from lively to ironic to contemplative, lingering on the power of culture to remember in its own imperfect ways. Through song and story, fragments of truth endured, sometimes warped, sometimes sharpened, but always surviving. And through culture, fragments of truth endured. Centuries passed, and the noise of the quarter faded into silence, yet fragments of its existence endured, not in songs or rumors this time, but in the brittle pages of archives. Historians and clerks, often unknowingly, became the preservers of a world the city had once tried to both exploit and erase. Their ledgers, ordinances, and court rolls, tucked into shelves of dusty parchment, now serve as some of the clearest windows into lives otherwise forgotten. The records are cold, stripped of emotion. They list fines for lateness, charges for disorderly conduct, names scribbled beside amounts owed. They tally the cost of candles, note the confiscation of cloaks, and record the exile of individuals as if such events were no more significant than the purchase of grain. In these ledgers, whole lives are compressed into single lines, reduced to debts and punishments, bureaucratic shorthand for human suffering. The emotional weight emerges here. Bureaucracy reducing flesh and breath to ink. A woman who once laughed, feared, cared, and endured becomes merely item, fined 2 shillings. A riot that shattered doors and lives is catalogued as incident of disorder. Even executions are rendered with chilling brevity, burned for sorcery. The indifference of the records is its own cruelty, leaving behind not the fullness of life, but only its punishments. The narrator's tone shifts through stages, detached in describing the documents, sorrowful at their flattening of humanity, and finally indignant at the injustice of memory itself being distorted into paperwork. The archives remind us that the system cared more about accounts than about people, more about control than compassion. And yet, even in the margins of these records, faint traces of humanity remain. An unusual note, a clerk's hesitation, a name repeated too often to ignore. But if we look closely, the human voices still whisper. Among the brittle parchments and stern ordinances, there are other fragments, less polished, more fragile, yet infinitely more human. Here a letter survives, hastily written, begging for leniency. There, a petition signed with trembling hands, pleading for the return of confiscated goods. Scattered words in the margins of ledgers, half notes, abbreviations, sometimes a stray insult or an odd gesture of sympathy, slip through the cracks of bureaucracy to offer glimpses of lives that refuse to be erased entirely. Through these scraps, voices reemerge. One writer's tone carries fear, desperate to avoid exile. Another leaves behind a touch of humor, a mocking jab at the authorities, perhaps smuggled into the record by a sympathetic scribe. In still another, we find longing, a request to be reunited with family, or for the simple chance to remain in the only home ever known. Though faint, these words remind us that the people behind the fines and punishments were not abstractions, but full beings who felt, resisted, and dreamed. The emotional weight strikes hardest here, humanity breaking through the official silence. Against ledgers that sought to reduce them to figures, these fragments insist on being remembered as human. They are the sigh in the courtroom, the laugh in the alley, the tear in the corner of a page. Though centuries have passed, they resist erasure, haunting the margins of history with quiet defiance. The narrator's tone moves carefully from faint to poignant to reverent. These are not grand monuments or celebrated texts, but the fragile residue of ordinary lives, speaking across time with voices too soft to have been heard in their own day, but impossible to ignore now. And those whispers guide us back to the street we began with. We return now to the same cobbled street where our journey began. Dawn spills its pale light across the stones, soft and quiet, as if nothing extraordinary has ever happened here. The shutters creak open one by one, merchants set out their wares, and the first sweep of brooms clears away the dust of the night. A baker carries fresh loaves to his stall, the smell of bread floating into the air. Life resumes with a practiced rhythm, the surface calm, betraying no sign of the storms that once raged in these alleys. Yet in that calm, something unsettles. The walls still remember the fires that licked against them, their stones darkened though painted over. The doorways, freshly swept, still hold the memory of those who passed through with hesitation, with longing, with fear. It is an uneasy quiet, one that feels less like peace and more like the careful smoothing of a surface meant to hide the cracks beneath. Normalcy has returned, yes, but it is the kind of normalcy that hovers like a mask, convincing only if you do not look too closely. The emotional beat is haunting. To walk here in the early light is to sense what lingers beneath. The laughter, the cries, the whispers, the names lost to fire and plague, to punishment and silence. The street plays at being ordinary, but every stone is heavy with memory. Every shadow carries echoes of what we have traced through history. The narrator's tone flows from calm to uneasy, and finally to haunting reflection. After all that has been described, the hypocrisy, the suffering, the survival, the return to the street is not an ending, but a reminder. The cycle has been smoothed over, hidden beneath routine, but it has not vanished. Because beneath normalcy, the cycle still spun. At this point, the narrator can no longer keep the pattern in shadows. It must be named aloud, for it has repeated too clearly to ignore. First came the condemnation, sermons thundering from pulpits, officials declaring sin a stain upon the city. Then came the exploitation, those very sins taxed, regulated, and profited from, turned into coin that built bridges, funded walls, and lined the purses of men who denounced them in public. Next, rebellion, torches in the streets, doors smashed, crowds shouting for justice or vengeance. And finally, rebuilding. The same walls raised again, the same signs rehung, the same rules enforced, all under the watchful eye of officials who pretended nothing had changed. Condemnation, exploitation, rebellion, rebuilding. The cycle ground forward, relentless. The emotional beat lands in the frustration of history's stubborn repetition. Every generation believed it faced something new, that its struggles or hypocrisies were unique. Yet the pattern proved otherwise. The same system reassembled itself again and again, reshaping, but never breaking. The suffering endured, the profits accumulated, and the sermons echoed across centuries. For those caught inside, it must have felt like being trapped in a wheel that turned endlessly, grinding down lives as it spun. The narrator's tone sharpens into critique, exposing the hypocrisy of a society that built moral identity on the very exploitation it condemned. But as the words settle, the voice shifts to resignation. After so many centuries, after so many revolts and fires and trials, the question is no longer whether the pattern can be seen, but whether it can ever be stopped. And the question remains, has the cycle truly ended? If we lean closer, the echoes do not stop at the edges of medieval walls. They carry forward, whispering into the present. The narrator does not press too hard, but gently hints at the continuities, how societies across centuries have cloaked desire and condemnation, how hidden economies flourish beneath sermons of morality, how spectacle still feeds on shame. The architecture may be different, the laws rewritten, the costumes changed, yet the structure feels hauntingly familiar. Consider the pattern: public denouncement, private indulgence, profit drawn from what is declared forbidden, punishment performed as theater. These themes, alive in the brothel quarters of old, reappear in subtler guises today. One does not have to search far to see how hypocrisy fuels systems, how appearances matter more than truth, how exploitation survives beneath polished veneers. The cycle hums, softer perhaps, but not silent. The emotional beat strikes in the moment of recognition. It is not condemnation of the past alone, but a haunting awareness that the line between then and now is thinner than we might wish. The laughter, the secrecy, the punishments, the profits, none belong solely to history. They recur, reshaped but enduring, pressing us to ask whether we have changed at all, or merely repainted the same doors in new colors. The tone progression moves from analytical to eerie, and finally to reflective. The past does not sit neatly behind us. It mirrors back our own contradictions, showing us that history is not gone, but alive in the rhythms we repeat. And so, history is less past than mirror. So let us lower our voices once more. The narrator leans close, words carried not in proclamation, but in a conspiratorial whisper, as though the very walls might still be listening. The great halls of justice, the bonfires of persecution, the sermons of thunderous voices, all have fallen silent. Yet in the hush of the present, their stories still linger, not loudly, not triumphantly, but in soft echoes, alive in the margins, waiting to be heard. These were not nameless shadows, though the city tried to brand them so. They were people who laughed, who feared, who longed, who endured. Their voices may be muted, pressed beneath centuries of law and stigma, but they have not vanished. Each ledger entry, each petition, Each whispered song is a trace, fragile yet enduring, keeping them alive in memory. To listen is to honor them, to allow what was silenced to speak again. The emotional beat deepens here, dignity restored not through monuments or triumphs, but through remembrance. Though history reduced them to fines and punishments, though folklore twisted them into ghosts and warnings, here, in this quiet retelling, they reclaim humanity. In memory, their survival is more than suffering. It becomes testimony, proof that even under erasure, lives carried meaning. The narrator's tone moves from intimate to mournful, and finally to reverent. It is not pity offered here, but recognition. In the shadows where they once lived, we now hear a final whisper, a reminder that they existed, that they mattered, that their stories are still worth telling. As we close the door, the echoes remain. And so the painted door swings shut once more. Its hinges creak softly, the sound swallowed by the morning air. The glow of candlelight vanishes, the murmurs fall silent, and the threshold that once invited us inward now stands closed. We are left on the outside, staring at a simple door that hides centuries of stories, as though nothing at all had ever unfolded behind it. Beyond the threshold, the city resumes its steady rhythm. Merchants call out prices, apprentices hurry with bundles of wood, church bells toll the hour. To the passers-by, this street is only another part of daily life, ordinary, unremarkable. Few pause to wonder what lies within. Fewer still wish to remember. The cycle of markets, sermons, and taxes hums forward, indifferent to the echoes behind closed doors. The emotional beat here is silence, heavy with reflection. The clamor of voices, the fires of judgment, the whispered codes of survival, all recede into memory, leaving only the faint echo of lives lived in shadows. Their presence lingers not in sound, but in absence, in the haunting awareness that beneath every stone of this city lies a story that was once silenced. The narrator's tone settles into calm, then fades into haunting resonance. The door is closed, yes, but the echoes cannot be locked away. They press through history, through the patterns we still recognize today. Exploitation disguised as morality, profit clothed in righteousness, survival hidden behind shame. These are not just the past's burdens. The ending does not preach. It leaves only a suggestion, soft but insistent. If the cycle turned so endlessly then, are we certain it has stopped now? The door is closed, but the echoes remain, asking quietly, almost imperceptibly, what patterns still repeat?